All right, hey anatomy students. Last time we went through the introduction to anatomy and learned about life processes, what Earth needs to give us to survive. Today we're going to focus on homeostasis and a lot of terms. And this is maybe one of the most important days of this class in that we're going to use these terms for the entire class year. And you will use them beyond this class. Homeostasis may just be the number one thing that we need to pay attention to the entire year. And it's a word you probably have heard before. Um, we'll just get into the definition: the ability to maintain a stable internal environment. Most people go ahead and say the ability to maintain a stable internal temperature, and that's just one example of homeostasis. It's happening constantly in living systems in our bodies where homeostasis is trying to be maintained. If homeostasis is not maintained, then bad things start to happen. And it kind of is a hierarchy of bad things. For example, if you can't maintain homeostasis, you may not feel well. You may feel tired. You may feel like you need to take a nap. You may be lethargic. So that's like the first step. The second step is you feel sick. You feel nauseous, which means you feel like you're going to vomit. You have a headache. Um, your blood heart rate starts to change. Your blood pressure changes away from normal. And then beyond that, the next step up would be you have a significant illness that is chronic. It could last for weeks. And then, unfortunately, if you can't maintain homeostasis, the worst thing that could happen to you is death. There are two types of homeostasis. Negative feedback is defined as the output of the system shuts down the system. So the output of the system shuts down the system. When you see the word negative here, don't think necessarily numbers. Think that that this specific part of our living system is regulated around a set point. So, for example, body temperature in most humans is 98.6. 98.6. Throughout the day, you regulate around 98.6. So you're not at 98.6 all day long. You may be 98.7 right now, and in 30 minutes, you're 98.5. So it's a constant wavering back and forth between around 98.6. And you have a thermostat, like the picture off to the right. You have a thermostat where your thermostat is located in your brain. It's actually located right behind your eyes in your brain. It's called your hypothalamus, where you're constantly getting a little bit hotter and a little bit cooler around 98.6. Another example is blood sugar. You may have heard of insulin. So we have to regulate blood sugar because too much sugar in our blood is bad, and not enough sugar in our blood is bad. So we're always regulating that. We eat a big meal, and insulin is released to take sugar out of our blood. And then when we're fasting, for example, trying to get to see lunch, we'll release another chemical into our body called glucagon, and glucagon will put more sugar into our blood. So we're constantly regulating a set point of sugar. We'll look at a graph of negative feedback here in a second. There's a second type called positive feedback. And positive feedback is when the output of the system exaggerates the response. So you go to extremes with positive feedback, and it could be extremely high or extremely low. Again, don't think numbers when you see positive feedback. Examples below: blood clotting. So blood clotting, if you get a little cut on your finger, platelets are released, and they will produce fibrins and fibrinogens to seal off any capillaries and other blood vessels to stop the bleeding. And the more that happens, the more that happens. In other words, The more platelets respond, and then you get an exponential increase in a response to stop the bleeding. Let's say that if blood clotting were negative feedback, what would happen? Well, you would go through the entire day where your hand or finger would stop bleeding, and then 30 minutes later it would bleed again, and then it would stop bleeding, then it would bleed again, then it would stop bleeding. So thank goodness blood clotting is positive. Childbirth is another example of positive feedback. Those uterine contractions, the uterus is a muscle that holds the fetus, right? So when the contractions first start, they're weak and they're far apart. But that first contraction will cause the next contraction to be a little bit stronger and a little bit closer. And then that just builds on itself where the contractions get stronger and stronger and stronger, and they get closer and closer apart to make sure that the baby leaves the uterus and is born onto Earth. If childbirth were negative feedback, the pregnant female would have contractions, and then they'd stop, and then they'd have contractions, and then they'd stop, and the baby would never be born. Milk production is another example, and you have to have a stimulus for milk production. As long as a newborn baby is suckling, a mother will make more and more milk. So that's positive feedback. The output of the system is milk. So the more milk that leaves the breast, the more milk that is produced by the breast. Graphs. Don't worry about the specifics in this picture. Just worry about the shape of the graph. The set point is this line for negative feedback. So, as I said with body temp, 98.6 is the set line. We go a little bit above that, and then we hit 98.6, and then we go below that, and that's constant through the day, where we're a little bit above and we're a little bit below. A negative feedback graph then looks like wavy. So any negative feedback you see in it, if you see a wavy graph, you know it's negative. Positive feedbacks, no waves, and you can have either or. You can have an exponential explosion, say for blood clotting, or you could have an exponential or a downward slide in blocking. So it's not ever both of these at the same time. I just wanted you to see both examples of what a positive feedback graph would look like. It goes up, 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 and can't stop, or it goes down, 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 and it can't stop. No waves. No waves on a positive feedback. All right, let's shift gears. Anatomical position is a universal position that all healthcare workers know. So whether I live in Thailand or Canada or Japan or the United States, anatomical position is the same all around the world. And this is what it looks like. How would you describe that? Well, it's pretty simple. Body erect, palms facing forward, standing straight up, head facing forward. And realize most of the time, if you're thinking about a patient, this patient might be lying in this position on a hospital bed. And we would want to think about the human body in terms of this position. So this is like the standard position that we will base all of our comparisons on. Let's go to regional names before we go back to anatomical position. These are very simple. You've heard most of these names already. We know the head. We know the neck. Trunk would be your chest, your back, your abdomen, and including your pelvis, which would be your hips. Your upper limbs we call the arms. Our lower limbs we call the legs. So simple, I'm going to quickly move past regional names because you know these already. Now, this is where we get into anatomy being like learning a different language. Anatomy is kind of like Spanish class, where we're going to have to learn some terms that you may not have heard of before, but these terms are important to describing the body. If we say something is axial, we say it's a body part on the head, neck, or trunk. So we could say that the shoulder, not the shoulders, we could say that your sternum, which is your chest bone, is axial. We could say that your nose is axial. We could say that your navel, that's your belly button, is axial. Opposite of that, appendicular, is any body part that applies to the arms or the legs. So we could say your elbow is appendicular. We could say that your femur bone in your leg is appendicular. So just descriptional terms. We are three-dimensional on Earth. So when it comes to cutting the body, say in surgery, there are 3 different cuts that we can make. And you can see the first cut here. The sagittal cut is the only symmetrical cut we can make. Symmetric meaning, off to the picture on the right, if we fold the body in half, those 2 sides would match up with one another. So sagittal is right down the middle. Sometimes it's called mid-sagittal. When you make a sagittal cut, that leads to some directional terms. Medial and lateral are antonyms of one another. Here is what those words mean. Medial means towards the middle. Lateral means away from the middle. So, we use these terms to describe relationships between body parts. Let me give you an example. The nose is medial to the ears. So, the nose is closer to the midline of the body than the ears are. I can flip-flop that and say the ear is lateral to the nose. The ear is farther away from the midline, lateral, than the nose is. So medial and lateral are our first 2 directional terms. Sagittal is a body plane. The next plane, the next dimension, is a frontal cut. Frontal cut, you can see in the picture, would be down the side of the body. So, frontal cuts create 2 new directional terms. Anterior means towards the front. Posterior means towards the back. So let me use those in a sentence. The belly button is anterior to the lumbar vertebrae. Lumbar vertebrae, lower back vertebrae. The belly button or navel is anterior to the lumbar vertebrae. Flip-flop it. The lumbar vertebrae are posterior to the navel. So the lumbar vertebrae are closer to the back than the navel is. When we talk about 4-legged animals, like this dog or like the fetal pig that we'll dissect later on in the year, we get dorsal and ventral. We do not use dorsal and ventral on humans, but I think you need to know these words. So, the back of the dog is dorsal. The belly of the dog or pig is ventral. So the back is dorsal to the belly, or we could say the belly is ventral to the back. The third and final dimension is this dimension. It's a transverse cut. So right down the midsection, and this could happen anywhere in the body. It could happen in the neck. It can happen at the chest. You can make this cut at the legs, anywhere. You can slide this little plane up and down, and it would still be a transverse cut. This creates superior and inferior. Superior means above, inferior means below. So, sentence. The head is superior to the knee. The head is superior to the knee. The head is above the knee. Flip-flop it. The knee is inferior to the head. The knee is below the head. Dogs, pigs, 4-legged animals, we get cranial and caudal. Cranial means towards the head. Caudal means towards the tail. Because humans have a head and we have a tiny little tail hiding in our rear end, we can use cranial and caudal with humans also, as long as you don't use a body part lower than the tailbone. The coccyx is what it's called. So for humans, we could say that the chin is cranial to the belly button. the chin is cranial to the belly button, or flip-flop it, the belly button is caudal to the chin, below, or closer to the tail than the chin is. Proximal and distal. These two do not apply to planes, but they're very important. And here's the big asterisk. You can only use proximal and distal when describing two parts of the same arm or leg. It's only used on arms or legs. That's why I have a picture of Michael Phelps' super long arms with arrows. So, proximal would be this arrow, closer to the axial body. The other arrow is distal, farther away from the axial body. So proximal is closer to on the arm, distal is farther away. Here's a sentence. The shoulder is proximal to the wrist. The shoulder is closer than the wrist is. Flip-flop. The wrist is distal to the shoulder. The wrist is farther away than the shoulder is. Go to the legs. The hip is distal to the ankle. The hip is wrong. The hip is proximal to the ankle. The hip is proximal to the ankle. Flip-flop, the ankle is distal to the hip. Only use these two words on arm and leg parts. Superficial and deep are also unique ones. Superficial means towards the surface of the body. Deep means under the body, under the skin of the body. So, sentence. The skin is superficial to muscle. Flip-flop. Muscle is deep to skin. Intermediate is unique because it's the only word that describes the relationship between three body parts. It means in between. So, some examples. The nose is intermediate to the right and left ear. In between the ears. The heart is intermediate to the right and left arm. Three body parts. In between. Palmar and plantar. We don't use too much, but I think you should know them. They're pretty easy. Palmar means on the palm. Plantar means on the heel of the foot. So I could get a palmar splinter, a splinter in my hand. I can get a plantar splinter. I actually got one about 2 weeks ago on my foot. So a splinter on the bottom of my foot. You also may have heard of plantar warts. These are warts on the bottom of your foot. Again, we don't use these too often, but I think it's good to know these two. So, here's a little picture with all the different arrows for all those different words. And what we will do is when we actually get back to class, we will go through this together. But you can you can pause the video right now and maybe take some guesses as to what words go with what arrows. Let's finish with body cavities. These are spaces within the body. They oftentimes protect, separate, and support organs. Cranial cavity. Cranial means head. So the cranial cavity would be the skull, and the skull would house the brain, and the skull would protect the brain. And this is a picture of the skull with the brain taken out. Vertebral cavity includes your vertebrae, the bones of your back, and those bones would protect the spinal cord, which runs right down the middle. The thoracic cavity. Thorax means chest. So the thoracic cavity would be the chest cavity. And you can see a transverse cut has been made to show, and this is at an actual body, to show the thoracic cavity. The lungs, the heart are housed in that cavity. And here's a drawing of the same thing. The pericardial cavity is within the thoracic cavity, and the pericardial cavity is the heart cavity. So we have a pericardial sac that surrounds the heart to protect the heart. So pericardial cavity is right here where my arrow is. The pleural cavity is also in the thoracic cavity, and the pleural cavity would be the cavity of the lungs, protected by your ribs. And you can see this over here. There's a lung over here, just happens to be a collapsed lung, but here is the pleural cavity. And then finally, the abdominal pelvic cavity is the cavity that holds most of your major organs in your abdomen. There are two different systems to delineate the abdomen. There's the 6-region system. We are going to use the 4-region system. And remember, anatomical position. So you always think in terms of the direction of your patient. So right upper quadrant would be up here, with the major organs being the liver and the gallbladder, which are hard to see in this picture. The left upper quadrant is here, with the major organs being the stomach, hard to see in the picture. Left lower quadrant would be large intestine, small intestine in females, left ovary. Right lower quadrant would also be the small intestine, the large intestine, and a very special organ called the appendix would also be right lower. All right, that's your part 2 of Unit 1. You'll have some work to do based on this information. I'll talk to you guys later.